I had to ask you, is it okay to call you Matt? I had a guy correct me one time, even though my name's Michael, and I don't care. My last name's actually Ferris, so people would always identify me with Ferris, like Ferris Bueller.
All right.
When the movie came out back in
I'm sorry.
1986 or 87. But a guy corrected me because I called him Mike, and he goes Michael, and so I always feel this, and this is especially in the world we're in today because people get so sensitive, or you can't. I don't know. I think there's bigger things to worry about right now than if you go by Mike or Michael. But I feel better asking if it's okay to call you Matt versus Matthew. So either way, I'm glad we were able to work through that.
Yeah, yeah, we overcame that drama before it got awkward. No, I really am not that attached to the name thing. So whatever is more comfortable to you is perfectly okay with me. And it's kind of arbitrary. I didn't pick my name, and I don't have a strong association necessarily. It could have been some other name, and I saw the list of other possibilities, and I'm happy with Matt. Nope, no problems there. But I'm not offended if somebody even calls me, Jim Bob by accident. That's okay. That's okay. It's about ideas.
Well, and let me start off by saying I saw that you over the weekend Substack. You guys added a new Substack page, which congratulations on that.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, that's a Canadian Patriot review. We decided to. There's a lot of content that we'd published on universal history, which is pretty timeless stuff, and a lot of people just don't know about it. It gets buried. We've had this website now for 12 years, so there's a lot of content. We were thinking, damn, how do we bring some of this high value stuff back to light? So we made the Substack to do that and revitalize some of that material, going back to our early discoveries back in 2011, 2012, regarding the secret history of the United States, as I sometimes call it, or not the United States, sorry, of Canada, but also it deals with the United States, because you can't understand Canada unless you understand how the hell the U.S. got recaptured by its historic enemy, the British Empire, vis-a-vis things like the Round Table Movement, the Fabian Society, these various occult networks that penetrated via Bohemian Grove, that took over control of intelligence, the NSA, things like that. And so if you don't have that picture in mind, which most Canadian historians just don't know, they don't know how to think about that U.S.-British dynamic. So they treat Canada as if it's a thing. And we were, myself, my collaborators at the time were like, well, no, no, we're British monarchy. We obviously have a role to play geopolitically, as we always have within a great game. So what is that story about? So yeah, I'm excited to finally give people a second chance to review some of that material.
Well, that information is so prevalent, and I would say in America too. I mean, people. I like to think of myself as when I talk to people like yourself that people don't understand history, and they don't understand that history. And I don't know if it's a question of it's taken time to get to this point where we don't want to know, don't understand, but people, I just think they're in denial of where we're at with things.
Well, that's an understatement. I mean, it's partially what Orwell calculatingly called protective stupidity, as a cognitive layer that would have to be consciously baked into the psyche of the victims of social engineering after World War II. I mean, people often wonder, hey, is Orwell doing a warning? Is it really an authentic warning? They have the same sort of thing with like Aldous Huxley. Is he warning us, these great freedom lovers who just could see prophetically the creeping encroachment of tyranny early on before anyone else? And it's like, well, when you look at who Orwell was, who Aldous Huxley was, and what they were a part of consciously, as far as part of the Trotskyist Fabian operation that was out to do just those very things that they were calling for, you're like, well, wait a minute, it was probably a little bit more of an aid, a guide to planning the execution of the things that they were themselves talking about, and also predictive programming to get people into a bit more of an adaptive state where their imaginations would be increasingly shaped when thinking of the future, of scenarios that they had immersed themselves like cathartically into, regarding the stories that they would be given as children, that would then prohibit them from seeing an optimistic, more realistic future that would be free. So that's part of the predictive programming guideline that's been used for a long time. So protective stupidity is one of those things Orwell writes quite a bit about. Aldous has his own take on it, how to do it, utilizing certain Tavistokian innovations for inducing people to become more adaptive to their herd, their group dynamic within work, within school. So this is where a lot of the sensitivity training within the corporate sector, as well as in the political and academic sector, became really promoted in the 50s. Is we're gonna have people become more sensitive to the feelings of others, because feelings are just as like co-equivalent to truth. Yeah. And so you had things like the organizational manual of the 50s, the white collar, revolution idea of we're going to get. And so part of the ideas embedded within the organization man, within the white collar thesis, was that individual brilliance is disruptive and thus bad, because the greatest good in the Cold War is stability. Stability became co-equal with freedom. So this is the Orwellian merging of ideas into their opposites. Like, America is a revolutionary nation. It's built on revolutionary principles against tyranny. People bled and fought and took risks and died for the sake of justice against empire. And so the new American freedom became anti-revolutionary, because revolutionary in the Cold War, the calculation, it's all these syllogisms, right? Is communism, Bolshevik communism, funded by whatever Jewish evil bankers, whatever. That was what was being promoted by the John Birch Society, by the McCarthyite crowds. That is revolution. So to be a true American is to be an absolute fan of stasis. And if you see your neighbor with like Thomas Jefferson writings, or a picture of George Washington, beware. That's a sign you might have a commie sympathizer next door. You should rat him out. And if you hear people talking about anti-colonialism or anti-imperialism at work, or the kids are told by their teachers, if you hear parents talking about anti-imperialism, that's a sign that your parents might be commies. Go tell your teacher. Go tell your boss at work. So it became really this strategy of psychological terror, and in it, the individual who took initiative for moral reasons, like a Martin Luther King Jr. type of personality type, or a Paul Robeson personality type, they were relegated to the big category of you must be a commie because you're trying to disrupt the social order. And if you're an inventor, a scientist, an artist who's like resistant to the Frankfurt School sort of reforms being pressed upon your workforce or your school, that's putting millions of dollars of CIA money into abstract art, modernism art, atonalism, like nihilistic literature. That's where all of the money from the CIA was going, to promote this new type of human being that would be completely irrational, defined entirely by raw toxic emotions. And the idea there was, the CIA under the Congress for Cultural Freedom was saying, well, that's what's more freedom oriented, the to be emotionally unbounded by the tyranny of communist reason. The communist art and literature is all about logic and reason and manipulative goals that shape the artists of the communist side. So we want to be free nations. So we're going to promote the very opposite, right? Raw, insipid emotions that are unbounded by reason, and thus the most irrational shit will get the most money from the CIA front groups, including the Rockefeller groups. And for any artist or any scientist who still held a belief in truth and emotion uniting or working together, they were iced out. And in favor of that, it was like, again, sensitivity training, group dynamics. Are you an adaptive worker? Then you'll be rewarded. You'll keep your security clearance if you're working for the government in Washington. As long as you go along to get along. And that whole thing scrambled people's brains heavily, culturally. And now we're 3 generations into that. People now in their 20s don't realize just how many degrees of decay built on fallacy and fallacy, cutting ourselves off from our true, anti-colonial heritage. We're so cut off from that. And now, of course, we don't know what to deal with all of these like reactionary movements trying to capture the right, trying to capture the left, and doing a pretty good job of it in reactionary, things between Antifa and Black Lives Matter and other Soros-funded like reactionary liberal groups of drag queen militia members and stuff. that obviously will create a fascist right-wing reaction of, Christ is king. We need to restore order. And of course that's going to happen. That's how Mussolini and Hitler were successful. They were the reactionary right-wing capture of the Frankfurt School first generation Bolshevik. There is no truth but my sexual feelings and lusts, which was, I shouldn't say Bolshevik, but it came in with the Bolshevik machinery through things like George Lukács in the 1918, 1920 period, that then was brought in by the CIA. So it's always playing us by these extremes of emotion. They did that. That's the French Revolution technique of the Jacobins versus the Girondins. It worked back then to fuck up the French Revolution, and it's working today.
Well, what what you said, at the beginning of this, we're talking about laying the foundation, and we were talking offline a little bit about Hollywood, and now it's at the time when you see these films, or I'd go to a concert, like I saw U2 before the pandemic, and I just didn't pay attention, and I'm like, okay, I'm old enough to really differentiate all this, and it's just not going to bother me. I like the music for what it is. But now you look at this and you see, all right, this hidden messaging that they've thread into all this stuff between books. I mean, when did 1984 come out? Was it in the 50s? 50s or 60s?
Earlier. It was like the 47, 48 or something.
Which was right after World War II, right around that time.
Yeah. I mean, Animal Farm came out when we were still allies with the Russians. So that was also a bit dishonest as well. Like, all of a sudden, right when Russia has lost 27 million of their people fighting this Wall Street, London financed Hitler machine that absorbed 89% of the German Wehrmacht. Like, Russians were heroes. They stopped the New World Order, the Nazi New World Order, from winning with a lot of blood. At that same time, Orwell is going to choose that moment to come up with Animal Farm to, paint the Russians as the ultimate bad guys of the world. Like, that's weird timing right there. And it implies, in my mind, considering also what Orwell's role was, as my wife Cynthia has documented beautifully, within the British Empire's Burma operation, which was effectively 1984 in Burma, India. That was 1984 in practice. So he was already carrying out the torture techniques that he documented with Winston, regarding the rats in the face and all that stuff. That was being done as practice that he was doing as a chief supervisor of a lot of these torture tactics and policing operations. And then when he was sabotaging the anti-fascist resistance in Spain, acting like he was a socialist fighter against Franco, he was actually the one with Trotskyist cells that he was closely aligned to, sabotaging the real Republican fighters who were actually trying to stop fascism. So this guy was dirty. He was maybe not like as like consistent in his darkness as somebody like a Bertrand Russell or an H.G. Wells, who was much more like consistently integrated with their evil. He might have been tortured with what he was doing. I believe that that's probably true. But yeah, no, I mean, he was his work, definitely, the timing of it, the content of it, what its effect has been, I see it as very nefarious.
Well, and even, as you fast forward to the 70s, 80s, and today, I mean, I think of a movie, it's, another one of those things where the machine takes over is Logan's Run. I don't know if you ever saw that.
Oh, yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
With the whole idea of you live to be 30, it was like 30 years old or something. You'd appear in front of a board for renewal, but nobody ever got approved. And if you decided to run, these police officers would come after you and kill you. And I mean, so just putting these ideas in your head about these big machines, and we look forward to. I was just reading about, and I don't even watch Star Wars anymore, but they're making more of these movies. And you've got directors that are these still LGBTQ plus, whatever, woke, and they're just continuing on this trajectory. Which makes me wonder, Matt, do you wonder if the government is subsidizing some of these corporations to continue these messages?
Yeah, there's some books that are out there. I can't recall them off the top of my head, but I could maybe send you a list of things that I found nice. But yeah, I'm pretty persuaded that most of Hollywood is an intelligence operation and an occult animated intelligence operation. As I think everybody watching the show at this point, they've really come out of the closet. Like, it used to be a little bit more symbolic and subtle. In the last few years, it's like sort of an all-out, ball, as Putin called it. What do you call it? The vampire ball. He's like, the vampire ball has to end. But that's really what it is. It's these wannabe Rosicrucian immortals who see themselves as gaining their creative energy by sucking the life essence out of victims. And this goes back to, again, a Rosicrucian dream of the elixir of life that tied to human sacrifice that's been done for centuries. And with the whole elixir of life is we can cheat death, says the oligarch, who's part of these, groomed into these occult networks. I'm talking here like by people like Sir Edward Bulwer Lytton, and his real shit, the coming race theses, or Zenoni. All of these things gave rise to the vampire mythos of Bram Stoker and George Sylvester Virag and Anne Rice and all this stuff. That a lot of it was started as books, obviously, because we didn't have movies, and then it was translated very quickly into movies like Nosferatu and Interview with the Vampire and Buffy and all other things that sort of like merged sexuality and eros with death, but also with a certain weird type of non-death of the dead after you, because part of the logic of these rituals, right, is you have to, if you want to get the elixir of life, the so-called philosopher's stone, you're part of the inner elect, you're part of one of the bloodlines, you've been tapped, right? You've got the courage. You first have to go through a process that allows you to shed your old skin, shed the old things that were keeping you from being God, which is like the social norms, the conventions, the values, the ideas of religion, God, family, all these things. These were all like treated as the enemy of the false, of the poor, unfit masses who imposed morality onto the elite, stronger alphas of the caste system in order to weaken the alphas, so that the unfit might become more powerful than the fit. So you got this weird chip on the shoulder, let's just say. People wonder, like, what is it about the Judeo-Christian ethos that the oligarchy despises? It's this idea that the meek shall inherit the earth, that we're all made equal in the image of God, regardless of what family you're born into. You have a soul that can be made sicker or healthier based upon the ideas and your conscience winning in the war between your lusts and your reason. And so they hate that, the encouragement of that within Islam, within Judaism, within Confucianism, within Buddhism, within Christianity. They hate it everywhere that emerges. This sense that the organization of hierarchy is based on blood, on bloodlines, versus like actual merit of what we accomplish. They want to destroy that and corrupt it. Ideally, destroy it completely, or if not, corrupt it from within. So the whole vampire thing, when you look at the roots of it, which is just one of many different branches of the anti-humanist agenda, and how the Hollywood picked up these tunes, these melodies, and then applied it from the worst books that would popular or normalize things that were ultimately going to make us less human, give us less access to our human universal sentiments that make us human, as opposed to, like every animal. I'm ranting a little bit, but these are interesting ideas it's associations that I'm leaning into it. So it's the associations come, but every animal feels feelings, right? So every animal feels lusts and desires to cuddle and to run away from things and to fight or fly. Like that's every animal has that, and humans do too. But you're like, well, what are the category of sentiments that are specifically human? Like the agapic love, the sense of indignation over injustice, right? The love of potential. These are things that are really of the particularly human category that you get exemplified in great art. So when you go back to the battles of Hollywood, or even the battles earlier on of the arts in general around, the networks of Shakespeare and Marlowe, who might be the same guy, I don't know, might be true, versus a lot of the more popular garbage in theaters in the 16th century and 17th century. Or you look at things like Frank Capra and the types of productions and storylines that were turned into movies, like It's a Wonderful Life or State of the Union, or there's so many Capra movies, right, that carry these universal sentiments that just awaken something in you that make you cry something good. Like the end of It's a Wonderful Life. Who has not shed a tear? What cold-hearted, right, soulless thing has not shed a little tear by the end, where Jimmy Stewart has come out of the mire right, of near suicide to become like to have that beautiful ending. They're transformative. So it's that power of transformation of somebody who is ignorant of their deeper humanity, their deeper nature of being made in the image of a loving, reasonable God with a soul made commensurate with that eternal nature of God. That's what great art does. Even the tragedies, going back to Aeschylus, going back to Shakespeare, it's you're aching in a good tragedy, not because bad things are happening to people. You're aching because there was all this potential for the person who was wayward to become great, and they couldn't break from their jealousy. They couldn't break from something lowly, and resulted in them destroying everyone that they love, like Hamlet or an Othello. So it's the same sort of thing you get in this is what. And then if you look at the battle lines, I think the only time that there was like an authentic battle that I could see was during that dense period of the mid 30s to maybe the 60s, around the little in the wake of JFK's murder, maybe a little bit petered out into the 70s when you had people like Donald Trumbo, one of the blacklisted Hollywood scriptwriters who wrote Spartacus, but he also did a lot of other things too, like yeah, executive action. He was doing that with a bunch of really good actors.
Matt,
In the 70s.
do you think that, with that, did they
Mm.
allow some of these feel good or good themes, or, where the the hero wins, prevails? Did they let that slip through, or was that something to just kind of keep everybody off balance? And I'm thinking of movies like Rocky, for example, or, I grew up
Oh,
Karate Kid, or, which was a feel good, the underdog, wins. And is that stuff that because you don't see that anymore in film?
no, but it's they can't just crush natural human souls, like it's you can't just say we're gonna make everybody want to like have sex with corpses just like that. Like that takes time. It's a gradualistic decay that has to be put into motion. But what you can do is change the trajectory of because everything is trajectory towards better or towards worse. Um, so I look at things as sort of snapshots within a process of change towards better or worse, morally, intellectually, physically, and that's what I sort of see is like it's true. You can't find those sorts of healthy. I would say this is healthy, right? The good guy beats the shithead.
Yeah, the underdog, and let alone now, you're not going to see a white kid do that. There's no white underdog kid that's going to prevail.
No, no, that's not allowed anymore. But that's the consequence of certain other things having been gears having been shifted earlier on. And it's in that sense a lot healthier to look at some of the storylines and movies of things like, like look at what Mel Gibson was doing in the early 90s. Some of these movies um I mean, what was it? The Man Without a Face in 92. Like that was great. That's a great movie. It's bringing through uh, a a real experience of somebody who has been through horror and is able to rediscover their humanity through teaching and the love of teaching, especially kindled by the innocence of a young kid that wants to know like who's this beast man, and who actually is this Shakespearean teacher, and his wife was killed and he's been blamed for it and all this stuff. So it's psychologically it's deep, and I find it was like one of the last periods in Western movie culture. There's been like the odd one here and there, but that period of the early 90s, maybe mid 90s, was the last period that had things like, those themes were more normal in things like Judgment at Nuremberg in 1960. Um, the film that featured it won the Academy Award, and it featured, like leading Nazis who were on trial at Nuremberg for crimes against humanity. And Spencer Tracy plays the judge, and the acting's fantastic, but they're bringing real nuance, right? Like at first you're thinking, yeah, of course, all these Nazis are clearly guilty of things that they should have like known or should have known, right? But you're brought into the platonic dialogue, and you're induced in a healthy way to understand what goes into making a civilization that thought itself as democratic into a fascist Nazi state. By the end of it, the watcher of it, it's not as clear cut as it was at the beginning. And you're like, wait a minute, maybe there's a little Nazi inside of like my culture. Maybe I had certain prejudices that would make me susceptible to supporting a new type of Nazi machinery. And even Wall Street is brought up as being a financial backer with the Rockefellers. That's brought up in the movie. So that was allowed, right? That wasn't allowed because there was no fight. I think that there was evidence of a serious fight of battle lines between patriots, real humans who wanted to use the art and the medium of cinema to awaken the sensibility and emotions of people to higher things, against the encroaching fascists that were taking over. You got that with 7 Days in May too, right? Or that movie of the military coup attempt inside the United States with Kirk Douglas and what's his name? The guy who played Elmer Gantry. Anyway, that's a movie in 1963, but JFK was helping make that movie possible. He was bringing in the directors, John Frankenheimer, into the White House, giving him access to the White House plot, because he wanted that story told to the American people about the dangers of what General Lemnitzer, the head of the Joint Chiefs who was working with the Nazis, was actually planning against JFK, because JFK was actually doing what that president in the movie was trying to do, which was create a peace plan with the Russians and abolish nuclear weapons. That was part of what JFK was doing with his offer for a U.S. joint U.S. Russian space program at the UN. He was doing it with the nuclear test ban treaty. So he needed the people to be behind him and to understand these dynamics. And Frankenheimer did a great job with a lot of his movies during that time, even though they got stupid. He kind of went underground. And when he emerged back in the 80s, he was doing stupider things with Marlon Brando and the Island of Dr. Moreau with Val Kilmer. And
That was terrible. That was terrible.
So sad. Yeah.
Yeah. Is it hard for you to watch? We were talking a little bit too before Dune, the sequel to Dune, which, I don't want to spend a ton of time talking about this, because I'm going to talk to your wife about, when I have her on. But what were your thoughts on that movie, and what were your thoughts on it?
It was super entertaining. One of the most well done movies I've seen. As I fully enjoyed Denis Villeneuve's rendition of Dune Part 1. I found those immensely easy to watch, sophisticated as hell, highly manipulative. And in the context, I think, of what's being unleashed right now ritualistically with the end times cults in the Middle East, with a variety of occult variations of Christianity and Judaism and Islam, with end times rituals regarding either the bringing back of the Mahdi, or the which is the Islamic term for the Messiah, who will fight the Antichrist with an angel at the end times, at the world conflagration, or when the Messiah will come for the first time, says the Christian Zionists, is when we rebuild Solomon's temple. Or you got these Zionist end timers as well, trying to getting ready to kill the red heifer that they've socially engineered to be the perfect red heifer. Really talk about playing God, right? And the manipulations that these Bedouins have been suffering from by their own mystical Freemasonic orders of Sufi Kabbalists over centuries that had been working with the Templars, that were interfacing with people like T.E. Lawrence of Lawrence of Arabia fame. These were this region, since the times of ancient Rome and Babylon. This is the region of the Middle East has had these desert cults that see a blood and soil relationship with the sand, and that they've been manipulated and have worked to even kill their own fellow desert dwellers. And when Islam was created, many of these cultists were happy to run operations with Gnostic sects of Satanists masquerading as Christians during the Crusades, where they were all working on Baphomet worship together in underground caverns. That was revived by Eliphas Levi later on, and the Rosicrucian order that he was working with in the 19th century. And that people like T. Lawrence again, E.G. Brown, others, the father of, anyway. So yeah, when I think of all of what I know about the real history of the world, and specifically that zone and how these dynamics work, and then I watch that movie, it's creepy as fuck, man. Yeah.
Well, I didn't pick up. Obviously, I'm not a historian. I don't understand the history of it the way you do. But I'm watching this. Did you get that sense watching the first one?
Not as much. I mean, because I think about this sort of thing a lot. So my wife and I had certain red alarms picked up. We haven't read the books, embarrassed to say, just haven't had time. But yeah, obviously there's certain motifs. And then you look at, of course, Hubbard, like a friend of ours, David Gosselin, who I think you should do a show with David Gosselin. He's good. But he did a great essay on um, Robert Heinlein and L. Ron Hubbard and the author of Dune, whose name is just escaping me. I'm an idiot.
Frank Herbert.
Frank Herbert, and they're all part of the same network that's tied deeply into occult, theosophical, alien cults that are working on social engineering together, trying to create like new sacred stories that would be post-Christian for the new type of human that they wanted to create. So they need new sacred myths. Joseph Campbell is a part of this too, who's the guy who becomes a guru to George Lucas and the crafting of like sort of new Templar Grail stories, which is what the Jedi series was always about, as
I didn't know
Lucas
about
himself
this.
even admits.
I
Oh
don't
yeah,
know.
dude.
Can you take a minute and talk about? I don't know anything about this.
Really? It's a wild one, dude. Yeah.
Joseph
Well,
Campbell?
so
Well, he's got to be dead, right?
yeah, but he lived quite a while. He was like a hardcore right-wing McCarthyite, who became all of a sudden an Esalen Institute Big Sur speaker back in like the Esalen Institute being like one of these Aldous Huxley run, or at least two of Huxley's disciples, uh, manage this sort of think tank retreat. And there's a good book on it by one of the key figures, Jeffrey J. Kripal, who recently did a biography of the Esalen Institute, the American, the Religion of No Religion, in the early '60s. It went on; it still exists. Anyway, Joseph Campbell all of a sudden becomes one of these gurus to the new spiritualism of the post-Christian hippie generation, giving seminars to Esalen, and he finds himself on a team. And I'll send you this article by David Gosselin. It's really good, but it's run by the Stanford Research Institute, and it's called the Changing Images of Man Project, run by this guy Harmon. Um, and part of the mandate is 1974 is to take his research on anthropology, Jungian analysis of deep structures of different cultures and different stories, sacred stories, of different cultures of the world, Asian and African and European, and look for the archetypal, the universal archetypal themes, which is basically a Jungian technique of looking for what is constant amongst the change. It has certain useful practical aspects to it, but Jung was also an anti-Christian pagan occultist who was part of the Gnostic revival too. That's a whole other story. So all that to say, Joseph Campbell, who actually worked with Jung at the Ehret conferences in the 1930s, actually, because Jung was doing this thing out of this Swiss Bohemian Grove operation to get the intellectuals of the world who were all equally misanthropic and hated the notions of conventional moral values and Christianity and stuff. He wanted to sort of unify them in a common sort of beat frequency, which is what the original Ehret conferences were about. That was in Switzerland, tied to the anyway. So that's where Joseph Campbell originally was discovered. He became a hardcore anti-commie McCarthyite during a dense period of the Cold War. Then he becomes a guru for the spiritualists. And so his work with the Changing Images of Man series involve the need to deal with the lack of sacred myths in the American psyche. He's like, all we have really, the closest thing are cowboy westerns that sort of deal with the American experience as something unique. And it doesn't carry the punch we really need if we're going to be able to create our new order. And so this is where the idea of the sci-fi cult or the sci-fi religion being turned into the basis of what would be the future replacement religious culture was put into motion. It had already been put into motion decades earlier by L. Ron Hubbard and the Scientologists, and even earlier by Heinlein and George Adamski, who are all like basically doing satanic operations, with Hubbard being a disciple of Crowley, right? Doing like the Lima sex magic book of the law shit in the desert with Jack Parsons. That's what Hubbard was already doing when he then took on the mantle of creating this degree of initiation ceremony centered around this more advanced form of Mormon sect, because Mormons were the first sort of UFO cult in America, masquerading as Christian with a Christian sort of veneer in the 1830s. But they just sort of like updated it, similar sort of operation though. And then the idea was take the create a space in people's collective psyche, their imagination, where we would imagine a new type of world. The battle is on the imagination of the past and the future, and the type of world beyond our senses. So the storyline specifically that George Lucas is crafting is the need, as Campbell outlines, the need for a new set of Grail myths. And the Grail myths basically were the romantic stories of, you know, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table and Excalibur and Guinevere and all that stuff. There's a lot of these things. It was for centuries, starting in the early 12th century. A key cultural warfare operation to create a romantic fanaticism in the minds of people who just all of a sudden got awoken in their hearts this idea of chasing dragons. Let me go, and that was part of the propaganda necessary to make the Crusades, the forever wars, possible in the first place. So, you know, people wonder, like, well, why the hell did Christians starting in like 1098 start all of a sudden launching into wave after wave of jihad against the infidels who had taken the Holy Land? There was like many of these crusades, and they killed millions and millions of people, Christian, Jew, and Muslim alike. It was bloodbath, forever wars. And it was done largely organized by secret societies. Like I said, you had the Templars with their infrastructure built up over banking, with their hostels, their hotels built up, their means of procuring weapons and money, all the way down into Jerusalem, with networks into Egypt, working with a lot of their Sufi occult Baphomet worshiping brothers, who were all like into building Solomon's temple, because that's what the Templars were, the poor knights of Solomon's temple. They were all about reconstructing Solomon's temple. And so the way you would recruit people, and you needed new dead bodies to be cannon fodder. So how do you get young stupid people to become psychologically, mentally mushy and so romantic that they don't see that they're being used in an imperial war and are disposable? Well, you awaken these types of fictitious stories, right? Of Guinevere and all of these things, and they're all made up. Now, Arthur himself seems to have been not seems to, he definitely was a real guy from the 6th century who did a lot of good, who really disrupted oligarchical plans working in the domain of the Welsh zone of the empire. He did a lot of good, and I think they've been trying to like crush and obscure the real Arthur for a long time. We hosted a class on this a while ago. So that idea of creating these elite warriors who would have almost mystical superhuman powers because of their rites of initiation, which is what the Grail Knights would have to go through within the stories. These were called the mystery plays. The mystery plays were also a retake of what was already done earlier as part of the Mithra and Eleusinian mystery cults. Is part of it is, you know, you do your rituals. Part of the ritual experience is you then go underground to one of these caverns in the womb of Mother Gaia, the Earth goddess, right, to experience a mystery play that's highly enmeshed in symbolism, that then it plays into your initiation process. This is where the Freemasonic plays also got picked up later on, right, as part of that experience, and they needed that for the modern age in the 60s and the 70s. So Lucas was inspired to create his own Jedi. That's where the Jedi warrior comes from.
And the Force, right? The Force, and
yeah, it's a Manichaean. It's a Manichaean dualism, usually tied to some spirituality that's contained in your blood. Because if your parents had tapped into the Force, then it's chances that you genetically inherited that power of tapping into the Force. Very Rosicrucian in that sense. And then you could all of a sudden have clairvoyance, do astral projection. You know, all of a sudden you're kind of a demigod. And at that point, that warrior, that sort of Mithraic Templar warrior cult found itself a new home in the Jedi ideology, which is where you got the Stanford Research Institute again calling one of their initiatives the Jedi program. So they're trying to create, when they're doing all these MKUltra experiments on kids in the 70s, just, you know, there's thousands of these kids who are being put with probes on their heads and are told, you know, to guess what's behind this card to try to cultivate Mind Wars programs as part of the psychic spy operation funded by the CIA. This is pure MKUltra shit. They're doing trauma-based mind control and ritual abuse on children galore, and basically faking data sets that are trying to convince people who have money bags in the military and controlling the military that they should fund now a reform in military affairs, which is where all of a sudden this becomes brought in. All of the data sets cultivated by these Joseph Campbell connected Stanford research group operations, which also have a lot of Scientologists running them, like Hal Puthoff and Ingo Swann, and a lot of these guys are all highly, like, initiated Scientologists, which in my mind at this point I now just see as like crypto Satanists. And they're the ones managing this thing. So now it's being brought into the military. In Fort Bragg, this is where the movie The Men Who Stare at Goats is popularizing something that is really happening with Shannon, Colonel Shannon, who's brought into Esalen, doing these transcendental meditations, psychedelic courses, tapping into his mind wars powers to run through walls. And he's got these scientific studies funded by the CIA to back him up. And billions of dollars start flowing into reforming the military elite, starting with Fort Bragg, but then branching out into the new Vanguard Jedis, who actually are just people driven crazy. And the movie culture of what Lucas is bringing online is just feeding back into that space of a galaxy far, far away. A huge space is created, which actually has a lot of the tropes that are taken from L. Ron Hubbard first, who did that galaxy far, far away with an ancient, 76 billion year ago Imperial Federation run by like sort of a Sith Lord, which is what L. Ron Hubbard from Scientology was doing in his fiction first, before George Lucas picked it up and tweaked it. And then you have a battle between rebels and the Federation and versus the Empire that's big. And you got this whole space created, right, for a new sacred lore to be shaped, and then generations of creative thinkers are completely animated now by this framework that's been put in their heads that now involves alien battles, aliens taking us over, elite warrior, Manichaean overlord, all this shit. And this is then creating now a space where we're more susceptible to seeing like, hey, the CIA just said that they found 9 UFOs that crashed since 2002, and I guess that's real, right? And it's like, of course, now we're totally susceptible to all of this. What a normal human would be like, no, the CIA just killed JFK. They've been running like intel warfare and bringing drugs into our culture to kill us for decades. Don't believe anything that they say. That's what a normal person would say. But then you have all of these people saying, oh yeah, I guess the aliens are here, and I'm going to put all my energy into UFO disclosure and blah blah blah. And that's why we lost our ability to discern reality from fiction. So it's part of that.
Well, and the whole idea, because it's removed critical thinking and common sense. We don't have that anymore.
No, it's gone. Well, I mean, it's not gone, but it's highly crippled. And yeah, you see it with like Netflix shows too. The fact that the guy Edward Bernays' grandnephew is the guy who founded and runs Netflix. That Edward Bernays, that's his grandnephew. And you have shows like Stranger Things coming out there, and you just watch. I watch Stranger Things. I need some entertainment too. But I mean, still, like, know what we're getting, right? I mean, this is taking what I was just mentioning with these child trauma-based mind control MKUltra kids of the 70s that were working on the Jedi Mind Wars program, where they're trying to create super soldiers, and they're just turning it into fiction now. But that's actually that happened. Like, kids died en masse who were part of this program, and they were doing that, and then they make it just something we get entertained by, but it's real stuff.
I watched an interview with Jason Whitlock and Glenn Beck the other day, and they were talking about the whole Puff Daddy fiasco. And I don't know if you've been following that at all, but I grew up, I was in my early 20s, like that music. And, I didn't realize Jason Whitlock pointed out the fact that BlackRock and Vanguard, like they've had control of the music industry for a long, long time. I didn't verify it, but it would make sense because when you listen to the music, it's all about just putting these messages in of like, girls and money and power and, everything's transactional. And so now you see him and all the stuff that's going on, which, this information about him that's coming out, it's been out there for a while. I'm just wondering who the hell did he piss off or something that all of a sudden he's on the hot seat.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't, I don't follow it, but I can't avoid it either. And it's curious. I know that Ice Cube did an interesting interview with Bill Maher a little while ago, and Ice Cube made a point like, um, a lot of mafia types who are not black are running the black culture and specifically the music industry. And he went through a few of his own experiences, how he was being encouraged with a heavy hand to introduce certain degenerate lyrics into his into the creative flow he was having, because there's been an idea to make sure that nothing similar to a Frederick Douglass type of cultural process would ever emerge into the black scene again, or what Paul Robeson had done in the 1930s and 40s and 50s until he was MKUltra, or what Coretta Scott King and Martin Luther King Jr. were doing, or Malcolm X. They really want to make sure that that sort of thing doesn't happen again. A black soul on, as J. Edgar Hoover warned of Paul Robeson. So yeah, I mean the black culture really got hammered. And again, when you look at who's funding these things, you got outfits like BlackRock, you got outfits like a lot of high level Italian mafia, Jewish mafia, syndicates and front groups like running black culture in a serious way, who are very racist people. Like they don't like black people, like the ones running it. Which makes this whole thing a real sick joke, because they want to create little house slaves who can then be the local controllers of the degenerating process in their own, that's how the slave masters worked in the Confederate South, is you try to, it's more effective to get a favorite black servant to become the enforcer of the other slaves within the community, within that area, rather than a white slave driver going in. It's less effective, and you create a very slavish identity amongst local mini tyrants, who then are open to all sorts of rewards that then corrupts their emotions and their souls even deeper. They become more demonic in that sense. The pathway to hell is pretty much set in stone. But and as Frederick Douglass even made the point, look, at the end of the day, both the whites of the Confederate South are also equally enslaved by that type of system, as are the blacks, because on the one hand, the poor whites, who are like 90% of them don't own slaves, or 95% of the whites of the Confederate South before the Civil War didn't own slaves. They were living in squalor and poverty, though they had a feeling of racial superiority. But it's kind of meaningless if you're poor, if you're just as poor as the poor black people who you think you're better than. And then for the whatever 5% of slave masters who owned the slaves, well, they were also enslaved by an addiction to a system that kept them from being human. So they were just living in lethargy and in fear that there might be a slave uprising, which did happen occasionally. So that's not like a dignified lifestyle, even if you have a little, genteel manner or something. So like, look, at the end of the day, this whole system is run by a satanic element that's keeping us all from being human. And then when you look at like the operating structure of the British Empire of the 19th century, you're like, okay, it's clear who was like managing and keeping slavery in place and growing it was actually nothing American. It was actually based upon the British overlord class that ran the global, not just the global cotton trades that had been maintaining India, China with opium and drugs from India that was brought into China to keep them destroyed. That now didn't have textiles, so all they could produce was opium for money in India, overseen by British viscounts and overlords who were also periodically genociding them by controlled famines using Malthusian logic, right? But where were the textiles that Indians were wearing coming from? Well, it was coming from now London, that had taken monopoly control over the production of textiles, right? But where was the cotton going to come from? Well, India wasn't allowed to have textiles. They used to have the best textiles, but that was all crushed when the British took over. They like cut off the hands of all of the Indian textile workers and made sure that they had no economic sovereignty. So then now the cotton for the British textiles would come from the Confederate South, and 85% of the Confederate South's produce of cotton was purchased by the British Empire. And they had deep penetrations into the leading slave power families that are still there today, including in the North, right? A lot of the leading Northern families that were behind the abolitionists, that were running also terrorist operations against America, the same time as the southern branch was also preparing the slave insurrection in this, not the slave insurrection, the slave power insurrection. They were doing a joint gang counter gang controlled left right opposition operation run by the British. From the north, you had John Brown and other things like shooting up, Harper's Ferry, run and financed by Northern Branch Southern Right Freemasons like William Lloyd Garrison, who were all for having slavery exist forever, but they just said, like, look, our policy is let's just erase the Constitution and have a smaller confederation of maybe 6 free states allied with Canada, British Canada, and the British Empire with our own free trade policies with Britain as a special relationship. And we'll let the Confederate slaves peacefully have slave masters have their own not so free slave empire that will take over Cuba and Mexico, and they will have their special relationship with the British Empire, and we'll just do it peacefully, and Ralph Waldo Emerson and the Transcendentalists were massively supporting that idea of a peaceful breakaway, right? Of two like pro-British confederations controlled by the high command. And then you had real patriots like Lincoln, like Frederick Douglass, who were saying, no, let's not do that. That's a trap. And they managed to, thank God, be successful and bought us some time. It bought us a lot of time, but it's been forgotten. And that's how we're being played again. They want to create a situation where you have uncultured black people who have problems with crime, who idealize things that should not be idealized, but then and that ultimately will create an environment where you can get more radicalization of people who then become absorbed by radical things like Antifa and BLM to run civil war inside of America. And then on the other hand, you got a bunch of dumbed down Christian white people who call themselves Christian but are just totally victims of a stupidification process culturally and in the education system.
All the pro-choice people, Matt. Not cutting you off, but all the people. When people I meet, they claim they're religious and they go to church every single week, but then they go to pro-choice for abortion. Like they don't tie the two together. That if really a servant of God, you should be a pro-life person, not a pro-choice.
There's a variety of expressions of this thing, but even there, you look at it, you got a lot of the feds obviously have been trying to cultivate right-wing terrorist outfits like Timothy McVeigh's for decades and decades and decades. Most are not authentic. Most of them are being created by the feds and run by the feds, but they do function at getting dumb white people sometimes to get recruited into something because they feel a lot of like resentment. They have a lot of ignorance of their history or intelligence operations, and then they get pulled into one or another of these controlled cells. That happens too, and I think that so far, here's my concern, is that things have been relatively stable economically for the last several decades because we've been rapaciously enjoying the benefits of the new global slave empire of globalization, extracting cheap labor from people who have to get poorer and poorer every day for their labor to stay cheap, for our Walmarts to stay full of cheap product where we don't produce things ourselves. So we've become addicted to this global slave system, also just raping resources that can't benefit Africans or South Americans based on corporate powers that have taken control of our own government that killed our leaders. They've been doing this now for a long time, but it's allowed that degree of theft and murder of the what's called the third world, like what is it? Like 1.5 billion people today still don't have access to electricity. It's ridiculous. One in, Cape Central African Republic, 1 out of 10 children die unnecessarily at infancy, right? It's just crazy. But that's been done by economic design, by those who have made sure that we got too fat and decadent and lethargic to realize what the hell was going on, because we were just happy that we got our shit's okay. I'm paying my bills, I got my job, my family seems to be doing okay, so I'm not going to think too much about how this is all happening, even though we don't have industry and we're not maintaining our infrastructure. I'm not going to think about it. So we allowed that type of decadence and corruption to make us dumb. Now, however, that's over now. We got a systemic breakdown, and it's going to get really bad, I think, before there's any chance of it getting better. But when things get really bad, radicalization increases massively. So a lot of the people who are currently kind of holding it together are going to be tipped in both directions. And this is where I'm very concerned that a lot of there's a lot of Christian Zionists out there, like just having a hard on for the idea of like slaughtering the red heifers and ushering Solomon's temple so the Messiah can come back and we can be raptured and not feel the stress of not being able to pay our bills or living in debt. There's kind of like this nihilistic desire masquerading as a Christian feeling, but it's not really, because it's just like, I want to get out of this world feeling, which is pushing politics in a very bad direction. And you got Israel with a ton of nuclear warheads that they acquired illegally, largely through theft of U.S. intelligence going back to the 70s, that have the Solomon doctrine, right? Like they actually have a Solomon plan that's been talked about by Golda Meir and others, that when you feel existentially threatened, it has been a normalized military doctrine of Israel to do what Solomon did when he was being persecuted and caused the temple to collapse, killing himself and his enemies, including the United States. That's a target for the Solomon doctrine. Just kill everybody if you feel existentially threatened. So that's a chaos factor animated by something end times religious bad that troubles me immensely. And I don't know what it would be able to be resolved easily enough if you could get a patriotic sense of self-interest on some level back in the American leadership in some way. If all you would have to do is cut off U.S. funding and support to the bloodbath currently going on in the Middle East, or the same thing for Ukraine. Just cut off the funding and the support for a bunch of unreconstructed Nazis who are being used as proxies to create a world war with Russia. Just stop doing it, and the problem will be resolved. You'll be able to have a conversation about reconstruction and doing something differently. But right now, there's not a lot of that going on with Biden, and unfortunately, with a lot of the right wing groupings as well. There's a lot of this end times Benny Hinn, John Hagee, crazy, that's also being kindled too. So that's a problem. Even if they're against abortion, they're still like dangerous.
I know I'm running out of time here with you, but I do want to ask,
Yeah.
how bad do you think things are going to get, and what is your level of bad of what you think may or may not occur?
Okay, I'll be straight up with you. Okay, in my study of history and my study of dynamics, social dynamics, we're generally we've allowed ourselves to get set up for prolonged dark age, that will accelerate potentially very quickly into global chaos, but with a vector focused on the transatlantic zone, where the stupidity factor has achieved, like, it's the biggest spike in terms of like all cultures of the world. And we could feasibly lose about 95% of the world population if you add especially a breakout of nuclear attacks. Whether the only hope that I see currently is sparked by certain elements of patriots within the MAGA movement orientation, but even there, it's full of problems. That's the only type of thing that I see as viable inside of the U.S. dynamic as it stands for the moment. And globally, the only thing that I see as a game changer on a positive level is the Eurasian dynamic of Russia, China, Iran, which currently express leadership that understands the nature of the game, that are doing battle with their deep states in a much more effective manner than we have, and have created a much more viable system of political economic policies that are in greater conformity with what I recognize as being natural law. Whereas we've lost touch with that. And I see that also on the cultural level when we were talking about the types of cultural norms being promoted in the shows of Asia coming out of South Korea, China especially, even Japan, which is all confused right now, but they still have a different ethos and a different set of moral values that are things we used to have more in common in our movies and shows back in the 40s and the 50s, like we were chatting about before. We lost that. They're for their I just see a classical renaissance of classical principles tied to economic policies that are trying to create excellence and meritocracy with their population and with partner nations who have been abused by empire. So that gives me hope that there's a dynamic that is fit to survive morally on this earth, that I hope we could learn from fast. But unfortunately, once again, even on this front, I get a little sad when I see a lot of the better Americans and Canadians who would be more inclined to want to survive and recognize the existence of these satanic conspiracies, and they're easily being weaponized by the very same CSIS, FBI, CIA, MI6 manipulations that worked to weaponize us during the Cold War. They're the same patterns, the same formulas of commie boogeymen out to get you and kill you is being like revived once more. Everything is weaponizing us against China to acquiesce to the oncoming nuclear war being set up by the U.S. military industrial complex against China. American left people who identify as sort of the left are being more weaponized to support the war against Russia and the technocrats that want that. The right wing is being more weaponized to go against China. Everybody's confused and kind of supports. Well, anyway, it's there's a lot of very dangerous blind spots that are being capitalized upon by our enemies who don't want us thinking about the undead British Empire, who has wanted and has worked very hard to destroy both Russia and China and India and the United States for centuries. That's what we're not looking at properly right now because of our prejudices being worked on. You know, the bad guys in movies in the West are increasingly Chinese and Russians and some combination of the two, and James Bond movies. So that's a concerning thing, I feel, though I feel hope overall that there is civilizational states operating the way that I see them operating, to fight this thing and to save humankind. But I don't know. I don't know if we have it morally within us to work with it or to go along with war.
Does it make you feel any, think differently of like, all right, where should I not be living in Canada? Should I, changing your strategy or even speaking out like you and I, what we've talked about over the last hour? I mean, we were talking offline what VDARE, what the organization VDARE is going through, and something like that could easily happen to you, myself, others that you've spoken with, that I've spoken with. Has it made you
Yeah.
feel differently or think
Yeah, I
differently?
mean, it's look, the way I see it, we're all in this together. I don't feel like it's anything personal. I'm looking at, bills going through the Canadian Parliament too that I could see very easily justifying the shutdown of my ability to make a living, my ability to not be in an internment camp. That's a concern, but I see the same thing happening across U.S. states. I see it happening in Europe. There's a war, there's a death cult that has declared war on life, and they're active. Currently, I do see value in fighting and saying using the platform that I have, which comes with certain responsibilities to try to help clarify certain things for people who need to understand what the minefield is. Um, do I ever have these conversations and think these thoughts of like, well, maybe a backup plan would be good if shit, if the house on fire becomes unrepairable? Yeah, I have those conversations. I look at things. I don't know how viable it is, but I wouldn't blame. I know a lot of Canadians, some Americans that I know have moved out of their countries, to Russia, to South American countries, and I don't blame them. I It's not impossible that I would never do that, but right now I don't see that it's necessary that I do that at this point. But yeah, it's a legitimate thing to look at.
Where can people find you, Matt?
Sure. Yeah. So CanadianPatriot.org. And also the new Substack, CanadianPatriotReview.substack.com. RisingTideFoundation.net. I manage that with my wife Cynthia Chung. Brilliant analyst. She's doing a couple of movies right now, a film series that she's working on to help shed light on some of these dynamics from a different direction. And books. So we produce a lot of books. They're all available, easy to find on CanadianPatriot.org. And the last thing, the documentaries. So we're doing the Hidden Hand Behind UFOs that goes deep into the occult and a lot of history. We've done 2 of what will be 8 episodes that are now currently public, and people can watch those if they want to. It's crowdfunded, so if they want to, each video costs us about $5,000 to $7,000. So we're asking people to make little donations, and it goes a long way to helping us make more of these films and open the multimedia front. So yeah.
Matt, as always, thanks for coming back on and speaking with me. And thank you for everything you're doing. Thank you for everything your wife Cynthia is doing. I look forward to talking to her here soon. And I look forward to more conversations with you in 24.
Absolutely, dude. All right. Talk to you later, Mike.
Mic drop.